Well, good evening. Welcome to our Sunday evening Bible study. We're glad you could make it with us this evening, and hopefully we'll have a great Bible study. Last week we had some exciting conversations, and we hope that if you're online that you will chime in. I'm watching the comments, so I'll be able to respond as we go through the class. We're going to look at chapter 10, cover it real quick, and then we're going to jump on into 11. We've been looking at the conquest of the land of Canaan as the Israelites are coming in and taking the inheritance. So before we get a little further, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Our most merciful and loving Father, thank you so much for all that you do for us. And we are so humbled as we consider your love and your desire to bless us is beyond what we would ever deserve. We thank you, Father, for this opportunity that we can study your word. We pray for all those who are with us in this Bible study, that we would be able to draw from it some wisdom that would help to shape us into the servant that we need to be in your kingdom. We ask all this in Christ's name, amen. So last week we looked at the southern kingdom conquest and the battle of what I call the five kings. A lot of people call it the battle of the five kings, and how that initiated and really started a battle that didn't really wasn't on the grounds of the way Joshua would have necessarily wanted to start the type of a conquest of the South, but it kind of brought him out and had to come up and engage in battle. And that was all because of the Gibeonites and their deceptiveness and the way that he came up and tried to portray themselves as being a people from faraway land, which then by Mosaic law they could have entered into a treaty which would have spared them. And they did. And in that caused the Gibeonites to now become subjected to being servants to the Israelites, and they're going to continue to be that way. But then also, because they were a pretty significant force, caused the southern kings to become upset, and so they mobilize and they come up and they try to attack Gibeon. So Gibeon sends a message, the Gibeonites send a message to Joshua saying, look, we're still your servants, and now we're in this agreement. You need to come and protect us. And so they do so. And overnight, they travel up, and they are able to then surprise the kings. And in that, and the one thing that we keep hearing, we keep seeing in here is this idea of how that God is telling Joshua, that I'm the one doing this. I'm going to bring them into your hand. And that phrase is constant. We see that all the time. Hello, Aline and Taro. Glad you guys could be with us this evening. You joined us. So that was kind of a startling thing when we look at the way that when we look at the different kings, these five kings, starting down all the way to Eglon, Makeda. They come up. These blue route here is the direction in which they traveled up to try to come up and to attack. So all of this blue route, as they traveled up and were sitting up and ready to attack, then Joshua, he comes up from Gilgal, and he then positions and comes up overnight, traveling all night long. And once he arrives, is able to rout them. And in doing so, they take off and flee and start running the opposite direction, down this direction here, Beth Horon. And this is when God becomes involved and starts really bringing down stones of hell, and kind of like I called artillery, and basically shelled them all the way down to here. And as they were pursued, and it's recorded, we see that there were more people killed by God with the stones than were by the sword that day. So they try to flee and come on down. They're caught down here. Joshua basically defeats them, and then he turns and starts defeating the other cities. The five kings are trapped in a cave. Joshua keeps them there until he's got the area secured, and then comes back. And in that was so symbolic, where he brings out the kings, lines them up, puts them on the ground, and he tells all the elders, basically his commanders, to come up there and to put their foot on their neck. And that's what I want you to see, that there's nothing about them that is powerful or fearful, that this is what God is doing, and they are now under your foot. And then he executes them. And so then we have them turning north. And so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to go through the northern. We're going to talk about the division of the land. I'm not going to hit it real detailed, but kind of look at the overview distribution of the land, some complications, some problems that they're going to have in finishing up. It's kind of like an invading army that has come in and basically defeated all the major threats, but they still have what you may have heard the term mopping up operations, where there's still some areas that need to be controlled. And so that's what we're going to see in chapter 11. And so as they turn into going to the north and picking up in chapter 11, and I'm going to just read. I'm not putting up any scripture and stuff because there's so much I'm going to be jumping back and forth on. We see that when Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard of this, and what did he hear? He heard about that massive defeat of all the kings in the south. So now he's turning north, and the king of Hazor hears this. So he sent to Joab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country, and in Arba, south of Keroth, and in the lowland, and in Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Shimron, in the land of Mizpah. And they all came out with their troops, a great horde, like in a number like the sand that is on the seashore, and very many horses and chariots. And all of these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the Waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So immediately they come to the alarm, and they send out and they start to come together and bring all their forces together in a pretty large area. If you look at the map, we're looking at really the very northern past, and this is the Sea of Galilee here. So we're in the very northern territory. I just kind of cut the map down. The red route here is the direction that Joshua is going to bring up his forces. We see that from as far as Naphoth Dor, this is kind of thought that this is the area. As far down here that they travel up, these are roads and coming around. Hezron is basically the king who is organizing this and calling them to rally. He's talking about troops and getting kings and people mobilized from up here in the northern all the way around this whole region here, basically, because Joshua has decisively divided, basically, as you see across here, and now he's going to be moving forth. So they're set up. There's a couple of things that we see right away that I see, is that one, they have the military advantage. The enemy, referring to the northern kingdoms, one, it's on their terrain, and that means a lot, because they know where everything's at. They know where the valleys, the grass, the rocks, and everything about it, and they're able to deploy and fight. So they have chose this battleground, and that is something that, as a commander, you want to pick it. You don't want your enemy to pick it. So Joshua is coming up at a great disadvantage. I won't say a great disadvantage, because he's got God on his side. But we see that Joshua is not able to pick, again, the battleground. Just like in the south, where because of the Gibeonites and them being attacked, it provoked and caused Joshua to have to come out and go all night long right into battle. This is, again, giving the idea to the people of Israel that God is the one that's in charge of this. God is the one that's bringing the victory. You can think you have all these disadvantages, and you could sit and plan yourself into failure. And that's some of the things I see on all these battles, is that there's so many things that Joshua could have just kind of kicked back and said to himself, well, I'm going to wait till the battleground is mine, where I can pick. I'm going to draw them out. No, you never see that. You see that with God's guidance, every time Joshua charges, Joshua is able to rout these armies. So they, again, it seems as well from looking at the scripture, they're very much outnumbered. And it's even described when we see the way talking about saying that like sand that is on the seashore. That is a phrase in saying it, you can't count them. They're just so many that you can't count them. Last count, we're looking, different forces, the way that Joshua would deploy. We're looking at possibly 100,000 that he could probably muster up men. And so, but if you look at the number of countries and kingdoms that they're listing here, you can see that they're outnumbered. The other thing is technology of warfare and weapons. This having a chariot was like having a tank. And the advantages of having a tank against infantry is huge, huge. Infantry do not like to take up and go and fight tanks. Soldiers are always fighting with tanks when you have them. The Israelites do not have tanks. They're infantry. So you can see again, it would be very intimidating for you if you were someone that was intimidated like that, and looking at the numbers of troops. They're on their home ground. They're picking the battlefield, everything about it, and also the technology. They have the modern chariots and things in which they could take advantage of us. They can maneuver much faster around us. You could just find all sorts of things that somebody could say, this is not a time to fight with these guys. But again, it's not them doing it, is it? It's God himself that's doing this. And so all these kings encamp, and they're ready to go. Now God, in verse 6 says, and the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. For tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them, slain, to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So, giving him that confidence. Tomorrow, they're all going to be dead. I'm going to give them over to you. But he tells them about burning the chariots and hamstringing the horses. Hamstringing was kind of a little bit of a mutilation of the animal, cutting the hamstring to where the animal could not be used. I mean, it didn't kill them, but they were never going to be able to bear weight and walk normal. And definitely they would not be able to pull chariots. So, and I think that one of the reasons for this is that God doesn't want, it to be reused. He doesn't want the chariots to be used. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that he doesn't want the Hebrews to think that, wow, we'll just take these chariots and we can use them and gain advantage. They already have. That's just something God's been trying to really show them. They already have the greatest advantage. You know, there's so many things that we can look at as we keep going through this conquest and the way that we view challenges in our work in God's kingdom. And many times we look at other denominations or people who are claiming to be Christians and the methodologies they're using and think, wow, you know, maybe we need to go that route. Maybe we need to do certain things to entertain or to attract so that we can grow in numbers. And to me, that's like, no, burn the chariots. Burn the chariots. Don't try to make yourself look like anybody else except the Bible. So I kind of think that there's some powerful lessons in understanding that we don't need to mimic worldly, supposedly religious organizations to mimic their success when we already have the greatest advantage, and that's God's word. God's word alone is something that we should have that confidence in. So, verse 8, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as Great Sidon and Misraph Maim, and eastward as far as the valley of Mizpah, and they struck them until he left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord said to him. He hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire. And Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor formerly was the head of all those kingdoms. And they struck with the sword all who were in it, devoting them devoting them to destruction. There was none left that breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all their kings Joshua captured and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But none of these cities that stood on mounds did Israel burn, except Hazor alone that Joshua burned. And all the spoils of these cities and the livestock and the people of Israel took their plunder. But every person they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, they did not leave any who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all the Lord had commanded Moses. That is the most powerful statement right there. Is this, when I read that, the first thing I thought of was Saul. How King Saul, the first king of Israel, was the biggest failure in this right here, because he did not do what the Lord had commanded. And because of that, God rejected him as king. And here, this is a great compliment, but it shows that it's through that faithfulness that he had such great victories. Now, as far as when we look at the destruction, it seems when this battle, these dotted lines up here on the map, when we look at them, they are their routes that they're chasing them back. And this is the furthest out. It said, as far as Sidon. And then he says Joshua then pursued them and chased them back. And here at Hazor, which was where the king that kind of like the main king of this region. Remember, a lot of these areas are just city-states with a king with a city. But there are some areas you can tell that had one king that did have a higher influence over the others around. And by this we can see. And the judgment was pretty swift and pretty brutal on Hazor because of his sinfulness. Now that's the other thing again, is that there were those, when you hear this talking about devoted them to destruction, there was a difference between some of the cities that were devoted to destruction and burnt to the ground, and those that were left up. Now remember, one of the things that God had told the children of Israel was that they were going to come into a land of milk and honey, that they were going to have vineyards that they did not plant, they're going to have houses that they did not build, that they were going to get these cities that, are still there. They did not burn them all down, because then it wouldn't be what God had promised. And so there are these that we read here that some of those were left intact, but basically the people were purged out, and that also all of the livestock and things were plundered, but they remained. But some of the cities were devoted because of the leadership of the spiritual abominations in which they were involved in. And let's never forget the Amorites, and we'll talk a little bit more later on if we get to it tonight, about how wicked they were. And I'll always keep bringing this up. This is not God's way of trying to clean house so he can bring his people in and give them some real estate. This is not an eviction notice just to evict like we see some landlords do to people. This is a judgment against the evil that is going on by these people in this area. And those who are responsible for it the most are the ones in which you see that are dedicated to destruction, devoted to destruction, as he says there. Now, the city, the land has been from north to south pretty much conquered. I mean, the major threats are done. There may be some area of resistance, but not a lot. There are some focused areas that are still needing to be suppressed and cleaned out. But now the writer of Joshua comes in and starts talking about the way that they divide. Now, before that, in chapter 12, before we jump up to 13, we see that the writer of Joshua talks about the number of kings that were defeated by Moses and then defeated by Joshua. And we know that all the kings that Moses defeated were on what we call the Transjordan, or on the other side of the Jordan, and defeated all of those kings. And there are 3 or 4. There's not quite as many, but man, when you look at Joshua's, there's 31 kings, 31 kings that are listed here. Now, when the writer is writing, we've noticed and seen his style that there are times that he will stop and give kind of a narrative and then move on. And so, we're going to see some things where if you try to read it chronologically, you'd say, oh, well, they already did this, and now they're doing it again. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But so now that's why he now stops. But then in 13, this is part of the narrative of the condition of the people, and where the writer of Joshua now comes in and he says, now to Joshua, he said, you are old and advanced in years, and there is yet much land to possess. There's a lot that still remains. And he goes through, and the core of it really is up in the mountains, up in the north, and down in the south, we see where the Philistines, Gath, Ashdod, those on the coast that are going to stay there, that when David comes along. Yeah, so the Philistines all the way down that strip of land, all the way pretty much down to Egypt, that should have been taken and still remain. Gaza, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron are listed in those areas there. And so there's still a lot that God is telling him that he's old. Now, at the time that Joshua, the estimated age is he's probably getting close to 100 years old. We know that he dies at 110, so he is getting up there in age as well. So he divides the inheritance first, and that's where we come back now. The writer comes back, he's identified, he makes a statement about there's still land that needs to be taken care of, but then he comes in and says about the inheritance and talks about giving the inhabitants and giving the land and dividing it up. And goes through great detail of all of this. One of the things about the way that they chose this is kind of confusing when we talk about drawn by lot. There's a lot of questions about, how was that done? Well, they did it at the tabernacle. So at the tent of the meeting, they would bring in the elders of the tribes. And from there, the process was something that even Moses had done and had specified. He brought this up in Numbers, about 28, talking about how that they would divide the land and giving specific directions to Joshua as well. And looking at the size of the tribes, because it makes sense. You can't divide these up perfectly equal. And looking at the terrain as well, it would be very difficult to try to say, well, you get this country and it's like worthless. And you could see the politics and dividing this stuff up and trying to keep everybody from fighting and creating almost a civil war. And so the lot method was a strong indication to the people that this is not a human decision, that this is something that God is dividing. It's God's land, dividing it and bringing it to them. So it was directed by God and communicated through the lot. The casting of lots or the communication of lots. We see the choosing of an apostle in Acts by lot. And as far as, when I look up the process of a lot, it's hard to determine exactly. They never dug any up and said, oh, here's some lots. This is what they used. Was it dice? Was it rocks? We don't know. But it was a method that they would utilize. I've heard some describe that it was some rocks or something that they would scatter down or throw, and that would make a decision. But I don't know how that would necessarily, especially when you start looking at land, and as far as how you would divide it up, other than size, because he was told based on population. So some are going to get a larger portion than others as well. So that was something that was important as they start to divide up the territory for everyone. And so the problem is still there, is what he's brought out, is that you need to still conquer. And this is going to be the one thing that's going to haunt them all their days of existence up to the point where they're taken off into captivity, is having never totally occupied and cleaned out the land. And a lot of the things that are going to destroy them spiritually is going to be because the fact they did not remove all of those Canaanites that were worshiping these false gods. And all the way up to the very end, that you see that influence with the last kings of Judah that were involved in idol worship, even human sacrifice. So what I want to talk about now is we look at Caleb. We haven't talked about Caleb. Caleb seems we kind of lose track of a lot of what he's doing from the time of the last moment you probably remember him about dealing with the spying of the land. And he's gone through the land once, and it's been over 40 years earlier, and that now he has got a bold request. The land is being divided up. This is a process that's going on. And that's what I mean about it's not chronological, because the request that Caleb does, and as we read some of these scriptures, we're going to see that it's like, well, did he go back and conquer it again? Or I thought he did this once. So Caleb and Joshua are the only two original from the tribe that come out of Egypt. They're very young men, but they were 40 years of age. Caleb was. We'll find out. Caleb says what his age is. So he grew up in Egypt. And at the time he was sent in to spy out the land, he was 40 years old. And so he says it's been 45 years. I think he'll say how long it's been. And he's been a loyal, faithful servant. And that's something we could look at his character as well, almost as equal with Joshua. These two men, when in their youth, were so strong and faithful, and they remained so all the way through. And that's what we see is the idea of his continued faithfulness to them. So, jumping here. So, starting verse 6. Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me." What a reunion. I mean, I was reading this afternoon and I thought, we don't know, but these are the only two guys that have made it through all of this. And you can kind of see at the end of it, they've conquered it. They were the only two that stood up and said that they could do it. And now they're looking at each other. And I love the way he says that. You remember this, don't you? You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me. When I was 40 years old, Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me to Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. So that's why he's kind of saying, you and I came back, and we're the only two that really said we could take this land. And a part of that direction, when we think of the instructions that they were sent in, was to go all the way through the land. They were to assess the strength. They're basically doing reconning and assessment of the land, and to bring back some of the produce. And they bring back, abnormally large grapes and some of the best fruit and samplings from the land that proved what they had been talking about. So, and that's what he's saying, we went up there, and those who went with us, but there are a lot of, in verse 8, he says, my brothers who went with me made the heart of the people melt, yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trod shall be your inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. Now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years, since the time that the Lord spoke his word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, this day I am 85 years old. I'm still strong as it was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So he boldly, that's why I say it's such a bold request, but it's not unrealistic. But there's a part where you wonder what kind of caused this in Caleb to bring this up. And I think him remembering the humiliation of what happened when they spied out the land. For him and Joshua, what they experienced was just so humiliating that now, guess what? I'm just as fit to fight. I'm just as ready. The going and coming, in other words, not only am I'm fit I am in great health. In other words, I am totally functional and I am ready to go. So his request is interesting. He says, so now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said. So give me the hill country. Give me this area of concentration. And this is where the overlap seems to be, because the same land that he's going to take kind of south, the southern part that we had already read about, and then they went to the north, and we're like, now Caleb's having this conversation saying, well, I want the south. I'll go down there and I'll clean them up. It's like, that's where some have said, wait a minute, I thought that they already did this. So it's hard to say chronologically. Is this something that was said, while there's, still coming in, or when was this? But the other kind of logical one is, like I said, they destroyed the ability of warfare for them to be able to strike out, destroyed the army, but there's still a lot of that mopping up and going on, and the fact that the Anakim are still there. And so they need to be cast out as well. So who are the Anakim? That is a very interesting question, and a lot of different great theories and conspiracies and just thoughts around who are these Anakim. And some translations as well, and even the Hebrews, it appears themselves, believe that they were Nephilim. And the Nephilim, if you'll recall, we first hear about them in Genesis. And back in Genesis, that at that time, in Genesis, that says that the Nephilim, and that is an interesting word because it's hard to say, is it a description of a character, or is it a specific type of people, race? And I say that kind of hesitantly because there are some indications that these Nephilim pre-flood were the result of the sons of men, the angels who had come down. And that opens up a whole nother thing. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, we read, the sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives as any they chose. Now, I'm going to kind of discuss this, and this is why it's called a Bible class, is to discuss this, because there are two fundamental thoughts. I say fundamental, anyway, the way that I understand it is understanding this verse all the way back. We looked at it when we were in Genesis, looking at Abraham and looking at Noah as a character a long time ago. But that the idea here that when we say sons of God saw daughters of man, the first and the most conservative, and I think it's just as safe, is that these were the ones we have, basically the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth, the descendants of sinful people and the ones that were righteous. And so we have this mingling of morality through marriage that has caused this corruption, because if we look in Genesis chapter 6, that whole chapter starts out, it's dealing with the fact that sin has reached a point where God is ready to destroy the earth. And so this idea that where the moral culture has been corrupted by the immoral culture, so they have intermarried and caused that. Now, to me, that is the simplest and sound and safe, but there's also another pretty solid kind of understanding, is that when we look at the Hebrew, which again, this is not because I'm a Hebrew scholar, but that phrase, sons of God, and now you could say anybody could put those words together, but if you look at the Hebrew, that phraseology in Hebrew, sons of God, is used 4 times in the Bible. And every time it has a link to a supernatural aspect, that it's not human. I'm going to say it that way. And that's why some have believed that these are angels who are fallen, and that in their fall, that they came down and that they did have relationships with women, and the offspring were the Nephilim. And so the counter to that I had been taught and that I actually used myself was a conversation where Jesus is talking about marriage in heaven. When they ask him about a man, wife, who all the brothers die, and that she's married to all of them because that was their custom, that when she gets to heaven, who is she going to be married to? And Jesus says, do you not know, angels in heaven are not married. There is no marriage in heaven. Okay, that's marriage, and that's not saying that those that fell couldn't have the ability to go down and have a relationship. So don't know that that is such a strong argument against that, because if these are fallen angels, well, they're not in heaven. They're not going to be bound by anything. So I'm just saying that, again, the more conservative, safer is the fact that these were corrupt, moral, incorrupt, and corrupt, moral mixing, and they were basically debased to the point where God destroyed. But again, there has to be some respect to this thought of the idea here of the Nephilim. And that's why now when we get to Joshua, you're thinking to yourself, okay, what does that have to do with Joshua and Caleb here? Because when we come back, again, I want to come back to this, sorry, got a little fragmented off, but in Job is where we see the mentioning of this phrase in Job 1:6. And it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So this is where Hebrew scholars, both Jewish as well as Protestant and Christian scholars, have looked at this and really said, this really does indicate that these are some form of angels that have separated themselves or had this access. And they call this like a council that, we see this twice in Job 1:6, when it says the day when the sons of God came. And again, if this is the exact same use, and God is the one expressing it and using the Hebrew language to express it, there is some common sense to thinking that this is what it may indicate. And then the other one is in Job 2, where the second time that he comes, it uses it again. And again, there was a day when the sons of God came and presented themselves. Now, Job, when this is written, this would have been, if you're talking about the sons of God, this would be considered a classification of a type of angels that in other references and thoughts are the idea that these are the ones that God is sending to and fro, that these are called, I've heard it called the watchers, that they're engaged in such. And then we have this classification, but now when Job was living, it was post-flood. So these sons of God were faithful, and they were going before God. Satan is the fallen one. But here we have, now before the flood, when it talks about the sons of God coming, we see that where the fact that they were cast down. Jude talks about it. Peter talks about it as well. Those who did not maintain their proper domain, Jude says 1:6, that God cast them down and bound them. And so there's some links as well to the thought that those are the ones that were referencing to pre-flood, that these were the sons of God that violated this. Now, the Hebrews, if they would have had this traditional thinking that the Nephilim were this type of evil and corrupt persons, because that's also what that word would mean, is renown. It does indicate people who were corrupt as well. So it can be used in a lot of different ways. But the bottom line is, like, how did they get past the flood? If the ones that we're seeing in the land of Canaan are Nephilim, as we read before the flood, how did they get over? How did they make it through the flood? I read one where it was as crazy as, well, they hanging onto the boat. they were giants, and so they were hanging onto the boat. No, I don't. It said destroyed. When we see that, everything died except for his family. The other one is that somehow it came through the bloodline, that it was able to come through. So that would be a possibility. No, that's also kind of ruled out by many scholars. The third one is that some of those watchers, some of those that were the sons of men, like we read in Job, had rebelled again. Or there's kind of a simpler one, is there's no relationship. These are not the same, which I tend to believe. Whatever we think of the Nephilim before the flood, they are not the same after the flood. But the word would have been symbolic and meaningful to a Hebrew who knew the history. Now remember, Joshua is written many, many years after. I mean, it's written way past the period of the Judges, possibly all the way up into the period of the Kings or somewhere. So this knowledge, they would have already had the story of Genesis, the writer of Joshua. So that association that the Hebrews would have had to that classification of type of people, and then the fact that the Anakims were giants, because that's what Anakim means, is long neck. If we look at the Hebrew, it means tall. They're huge. They were giants, no doubt. But were they Nephilim? Were Anakim? I don't think so. I can't say that that's true, because I don't think that would go, and I don't think there's another rebellion. If there was one before the flood, I don't think so. But I don't know. It's one of these things that, don't get upset about this stuff. Please. It's kind of cool to think about and get a little excited about, but, for us to start going, well, Ron's an apostate, I'm going to get him, please. This is why we call it a Bible study. There's nothing in what we're discussing here, what I'm saying, has anything to do with determining salvation. In other words, you're not going to get into heaven or out of heaven, thrown out, based on how you believe who are the sons of men. So I want to make sure we bring that out there as well. The last reference I want to bring and share with you about looking at the sons of men was again in Job 38:7. Now, it's interesting because now this is God rebuking and talking to Job when he goes through and asks him some questions. He says, well, where were you whenever I laid the foundations of the earth? And where were you when all this stuff happens? And he asks these questions rhetorically. And then in verse 7, God is saying, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So again, that's kind of another one that shows that. But again, we're talking about Joshua and these giants. And I think for just simplicity is to understand they're not the same. I do not believe, my personal belief is that they are not the same pre-flood as post-flood. I think that they were giants. They were extremely immoral and corrupt. There may be some things there. I do believe that the strong influence of their pagan worship opened the doors to spiritual exposure of more moral corruption. When you look at their sacrifices and the things that they were doing were so ungodly that I can see that part of it. And the fact that these men were huge. I mean, Goliath, 9 foot or so. Some of these that they've talked about could be is over 10 feet. But it's not outside of the bounds of nature. So it's still something that could have created. But these men, because of their massive size, had that power, not only in just a physical strength that they could make people comply and get away with whatever they wanted, but they had that ability to force people and the intimidation factor so they could get away with whatever they wanted. And if they were immoral, ungodly, and just base spiritually, it would make them even worse and more barbaric in a sense of the way that they were. So that's, I don't see any comments or questions. You're probably logged off, but so Joshua does give the request that Caleb has, and Caleb does push out these giants, and he pushes them out of that area and kills some, we don't know, but the problem was they pushed a lot of those out to the coastline in the south. And we're going to see 3 more. We won't see, but we learn of them through David and Samuel that the Philistines has a champion, Goliath, and he is probably a descendant of Anakims. So, well, that's all I've got for the class for this evening. I hope that you were able to get something out of it. Drop in the comments what your thoughts are, and please, 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 if you disagree with me, it's okay. I mean, I am not trying to force any particular thought. I want us to expand our minds, keep it simple, but enjoy the thought of some possibilities besides what we have just always just accepted. And kind of exciting to think of these areas. Sometimes we're afraid to discuss it. And I think that's why we need to have Bible classes so that we can open up these conversations, just talk about them. And that's, again, not a matter of salvation on what you believe on whether what the Anakims were or weren't. They were absolutely giants. They were absolutely immoral. And they needed judgment. And that's what God was bringing on them. All right, well, I hope you'll be able to join us coming up this coming Sunday morning at 9:45 for Bible study, 10:45 for worship, and then we'll be back here. We're going to work on looking at Joshua's farewell and rededicating of the covenant and kind of start looking at wrapping up Joshua maybe next week, and then we'll get on to another topic. We'll discuss that next week. So until we see you again, God bless.